Let's get started. Dear colleagues and attendees, good afternoon. We will begin the panel session of the Dissertation Board for the Defense of the Thesis by Liu Yan for the degree of Candidate of Political Sciences, Specialization 10-0110, Journalism. The topic is Media Construction of Images of Peasant Protests in China from 2005 to 2014 by the order of St. Petersburg University as of the 1st of March 2019, number 1707/1, I, Professor Igor Bohin, Doctor of Political Sciences at St. Petersburg State University, was appointed chair of the Dissertation Board. Allow me to introduce my colleagues, members of the Dissertation Board. Professor Ilya Bykov, Doctor of Political Sciences, St. Petersburg University. Professor Yuri Kluyev, Doctor of Political Sciences, St. Petersburg University. Alevtina Shevchenko, Doctor of Political Sciences, RANEPA. Professor Dmitry Strovsky, Doctor of Political Sciences, Ariel University, Israel. First off, I'd like to highlight that under the federal law as of the 23rd of August 1996, number 127 FZ on the Federal Law on Science and State Scientific and Technical Policy, St. Petersburg University is entitled to confer its own academic degrees. The corresponding order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, number 6821/1, was issued on the 1st of September 2018. According to this order, the panel discussion is valid, providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present. The total number is not to be fewer than 4 people. The Dissertation Board today consists of 5 people, 5 of which are present. Therefore, we have a quorum. The panel discussion will not exceed 2 hours. Now, let me announce the agenda. Item 1, the chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. 5 minutes. Item 2, the candidate's presentation providing an overview and findings of the research, no more than 15 minutes. 3, questions to the candidate regarding the presentation, no more than 2 minutes for each question. The candidate's reply to the questions. Item 4, reports on the thesis from members of the board in turns. Members of the board are requested to provide critical remarks and questions, no more than 10 minutes per person. Item 5, the chair's report on the thesis. Item 6, the candidate's comments about the reports on the thesis, no more than 15 minutes. Item 7, questions from the audience. The floor will be given to the non-board attendees. They can give a brief account of their ideas and/or ask questions to the candidate about the research. No more than 5 minutes per person. Let me remind you that it is necessary to fill in the registration form and give their full name before the talk. Item 8. The candidate's comments about the talks given by non-members of the board, no more than 5 minutes. Item 9. Report of the candidate's thesis supervisor, 3 minutes. A 5-minute discussion on the issue of conferring or non-conferring the academic degree. The discussion of the results of the defense is not broadcast. Item 11. Open balloting, vote counting and recording the results in the minutes of the session. Item 12. Deciding upon conferring or not conferring the academic degree of St. Petersburg University. And finally, item 13, candidate's closing speech, no more than 2 minutes. Before we proceed with the agenda, I kindly ask you to switch off your mobile phones. Let me announce that the panel session of the dissertation board is being recorded and broadcast on the internet. The panel session is interpreted into English, from Russian into English, and from English into Russian. Let us start with the first item on the agenda, Chair's overview of the document submitted by the candidate. Thesis by Liu Yan was submitted in conformity with the requirements for the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences. The specialization is 10-0110 journalism. The topic is media construction of images of peasant protests in English. The thesis was approved for the defense by the order of the SPBU Academic Secretary of the 1st of March 2019. The dissertation board was set up by the order of SPBU Academic Secretary as of the 1st of March 2019, number 1707/1, and I have already introduced its members to you. The candidate has submitted the following documents to the SPBU Academic Secretary. An application to Professor Nikolai Kropachev, Rector of St. Petersburg University, on the approval of the thesis for defense, submitted on the 24th of January 2019. Report of the thesis supervisor, Professor Galina Melnik, Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor of St. Petersburg University. List of published works containing 7 items which describe the research findings, including 6 works published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. Letter of verification as of the 13th of June 2018, number 393, certifying that Liu Yan was enrolled on a full-time postgraduate program at the Far East Federal University, the city of Vladivostok. The field of study, mass media, information and library science, and passed all the qualifying exams with the highest score. Document 5. Expert statement from St. Petersburg University on submitting the thesis, Media Construction of Images of Peasant Protests in China, for defense, approved by Sergei Aplonov, St. Petersburg University. To be more precise, approved by Sergei Mikushev, Vice Rector for Research at St. Petersburg University. And finally, thesis in Russian and English, a printed version with a manuscript copyright and a digital copy. The thesis formatting and reference list complying with all the relevant state standards of the Russian Federation. The above-mentioned documents comply with Item 12 of Section 3, Submission and Defense, of the Order on Granting Academic Degrees in St. Petersburg University, Appendix 1 to the relevant order. So we are moving forward with our agenda, and now the floor is given to the candidate for the presentation. Dear members of the dissertation board, distinguished chair and attendees, I would like to start with the basic definitions of my study. The topic of my study, media construction of images of peasant protests in China. Chronologically, the dissertation covers the period from 2005, which is the beginning of the formation of important role of Chinese mass media in the dynamics of peasant protests, until the year 2014, when the mass media regulation was stronger and media coverage of protests reduced. What makes the study relevant? First off, it is necessary to provide critical reviews of media images of protests to answer the question which interests mass media stands for. Secondly, many scholars believe that public protests marked the beginning of the emergence of liberal movement in authoritative China, stating that mass media facilitates democracy in China. However, this requires a more weighted evaluation of media mobilization of civil society in the opposition. Thirdly, it is important to understand the specific of interaction between countryside protesters and urban media institutes in the China which is undergoing reforms. What is the empirical basis of the study? First off, publications given in printed media and online media which cover 6 cases of peasant protests against land appropriation. We collected 40 cases. Secondly, documentaries, videos, photographs, blogs of activists, official statements, and reports and articles by journalists, court rulings, and notes of lawyers. Thirdly, laws and regulations and various decrees in the field of land use, rural self-governance, and regulations on mass media activity. Fourthly, online posts and comments on internet forums which reflect the opinions of protesters, journalists, elites, and general public. Number 5, interviews with 4 journalists. The theoretical basis of our study is based on several approaches: social constructivism, symbolic interactionism, the theory of the frame theory, the theory of cultural hegemony, the concept of mediatization, and dynamic models of protests. Frame analysis is central to our research methodology. The structure of the dissertation comprises introduction, 4 chapters, conclusions, and list of references. The first chapter focuses on theoretical and methodological background of the dissertation. The first section focuses on the Frankfurt School, the School of British Cultural Research, political economy of communication, critical discourse analysis, in the topic mass media ideology. Mass media is viewed as a relatively symbolic field of domination and struggle. The second section describes journalistic discourse as a tool of mobilization and demobilization. It provides the definitions to such concepts as the mediatization, frame, and contentious politics. The third section provides an overview of literature on relevant topics such as social protests and media activism in modern China. The second chapter focuses on the images of peasant protests in Chinese mass media. The chapter opens up with a brief overview of 6 cases. The first section describes the images of protests in local mass media, which is controlled by local authorities. It shows how local authorities in conflict situation manage these conflicts through its public coverage. The second section describes the specifics of how protests are described in market-related mass media. There we describe the frame which we call the protest of the week. It is regarded as a mobilization tool. The third section of the second chapter analyzes the issue of selective coding when creating the frame of struggle of the week. The third chapter outlines 3 structural factors which define the journalistic community of China: state media policy, professional ideology, and market logic. The chapter comprises 3 sections, each of which focuses on the definition and characteristics of the 3 above-mentioned structural factors. Chapter 4 analyzes the specific type of media construction of peasant protests in China, the so-called depoliticization and repoliticization. This discursive tool is illustrated by a number of examples of protests in Ukraine. Because these events had large publicity. In conclusion, we state that there is a number of contradictions in media images of peasant protests when it comes to the dynamics of social protests and mobilization of civil society. Now let me focus on the research findings. Local mass media, that is, information bodies of local authorities, legitimate despite the attempts of local administration to choose more institutionalized channels to voice their disagreement. This can provoke peasants to even larger fights. The protest of the week are the conflicts between the 2 unequal parties. Peasants are very often given as a weak power. Reporters show that all the protests are legitimate, and they call upon the society to support rural activists. The next research finding focuses on the motives of protesters. Peasants use unprincipled or opportunistic tactics. Secondly, land conflicts. Secondly, land conflicts within rural collectives of low solidarity get local government involved as arbitrating party and spill out onto confrontation with the latter. Thus, journalists have ignored other important causes of conflicts, legitimized peasants' questionable claims, and mobilized great social supports for protests, which to some extent encroach on public interests. My third research findings. It's based upon the processual models of the influence of structural factors of media construction of images of peasant protests in China. Chinese mass media also play an active role in depoliticization and repoliticization of social protests. Within the framework of local governments, there is a system of managing social conflicts. Here, the leading role is given to central national mass media, and they shape the general public opinion, which gives rise to a heated debate. professional ideology encourages journalists of Chinese market-oriented media to adapt frame struggle of the weak and to resist information control, though overwhelmingly great passion in reporting rightful suffering peasants impedes objective representation of conflicts. In addition, with assimilation of Western concept of professional journalism, Chinese journalists prefer interpreting peasant protests in the context of liberal relations between citizens and the state. Nonetheless, ideological preferences can distract reporters' attention from pressing problems that peasants care about. Impacts asserted on media coverage on peasant protests by the impulse to conquer market can be named as market logic. Market-oriented media focus on reporting events most likely to attract the society and prefer publishing news with dramatic plots, that is, journalism policies appeal to public opinion. As a result, market-oriented media shy away from assembling information against the popular narrative struggle of the weak, even when journalists themselves have doubts about sympathizing discourse. Now I'd like to focus on depoliticization and repoliticization of social protests. Chinese mass media also play an active role in depoliticization and repoliticization of social protests. Depoliticization refers to minimizing the anti-system radical nature of resistance. Peasants are discontented with exploitation of rural production, means for modernization of China, but the media conceal this structural contradiction and transgressive demands of peasants who claim the rights to defend themselves in violation of legal rights. As a rule, media discourse has produced the illusion that conflicts can be easily resolved within legal framework and minimized the possibility for public deliberation on pressing problems of social inequality accumulated in the reform process. Repoliticization is realized by endowing peasant protests with political meanings. Chinese mass media reshape the organizational ideas of resistance in a way that connotations of rural conflicts become compatible with the ethical reform courses, or the more neoliberalism-oriented prospect of socio-political structure transformation. This is it I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. Dear colleagues, let's now turn to the next item on our agenda. These are questions to the candidate regarding the research findings and the presentation. Liu Yan, I have a question. The framework of your study is the years 2005 to 2014. What about the modern state of affairs? Do you follow what's going on as regards peasant protests in rural areas of China? Thank you for your interesting question. Why did I choose this period? In 2014, as I said in my presentation, media control and media regulations was toughened, and media was limited in covering peasant protests in China. Now we have lack of coverage of such protests. However, protests still go on, and urban citizens and peasants alike try to find an opportunity to make posts about these protests in online media. Good afternoon. My question is as follows. You took part in research conferences in China. What do your colleagues think about your research? Did you criticize you? Did they encourage you? What was their reaction? Thank you for your question. It is also very interesting. Indeed, I made 2 presentations at conferences in China. In general, they share my viewpoints. What I have shared with you today is also based on literature review I made in China and the overview of Chinese sources. Any more questions? Professor Strovsky? Yes, I have one. I've been to China several times. Can you tell me, today the situation in China is as follows: limited criticism, fewer and fewer people are ready to criticize public policy. The party has done a lot to give its political leader more time as the head of state, and I believe that will last for a long time. Does Chinese general public understand the importance of the information you're talking about? My question is only logical. I talked to Chinese youth. These are young people who are students in Sichuan University. They say they are ready to continue living in such conditions as long as the state can provide for professional development. The freedom of speech is a different concept for Chinese population. If we compare what freedom of speech means for people from other countries worldwide, do people themselves understand the importance of this kind of information? It's a really challenging question. Thank you for that. I'll try to answer it. I think that society at large, Chinese people feel that a decrease in the coverage of such protests is obvious. How do I personally feel about that? The majority of people are passive, inactive. They are not ready to take part in civic protests. However, China has scholars, intellectual and cultural elites who focus on these issues. For them, they continue their efforts, their scholarly efforts, focusing on media construction of peasant protests. As regards land sources, there has been some progress. Now peasants have more rights to land ownership. Local authorities provide monetary compensation to peasants, and conflicts are now getting softer due to that. I also have a question. Unlike Professor Strovsky, I unfortunately have never been to China, but I have read a lot about the Chinese internet, the infamous Chinese information monopoly, the famous Chinese firewall, and I have a question regarding that. In your study, you mainly compare state-owned mass media and market-oriented mass media. Were you able to mark any difference between traditional mass media, I mean newspapers and television, and online media? Thank you for your question. In my dissertation, I only slightly touch upon this issue. The question of state media policy and professional media ideology and market ideology really affect the function of internet media in China. For them, state regulations are a bit softer because the internet is developing faster than lawmaking, and they have more opportunities to cover such conflicts and protests. As for professional ideology, these people are not professional journalists, so at times they do not follow laws and regulations in journalism, which means they're not always fair in their coverage of events. In such cases, they join this run for sensationalism. And they make local public have an adverse attitude to local authorities. I have one more last question. Do Chinese people know the attitudes of international mass media to peasant protests? What about international mass media? How do they cover peasant protests in China? And does the way they cover these protests reach Chinese audience? Of course, international mass media cover these conflicts. And sometimes international media even fosters Chinese peasants to organize these protests. China has laws that do not allow international mass media perform in our information space. Let's now turn to the next item on the agenda, reports on the thesis by members of the Dissertation Board. Professor Bykov from St. Petersburg University, you're welcome to take the floor. Dear colleagues, a few words about the relevance of the topic. I believe that the relevance is obvious. People's Republic of China is a global economy when it comes to its GDP. It's growing exponentially, and this success is due to the policy of reforms and openness, which attracted international capital and migration of labor from countryside to the city, urbanization, development of education, new infrastructure projects, and the development of mass media. Under these conditions, rural population is a donor that feeds the development of the People's Republic of China. Economic conditions are not at all easy. Hence, we have these protests and other types of social confrontation. Mass media does not always provide fair coverage of public protests in China. This makes the study highly relevant. It shows how protests are evaluated in mass media in a society that has stringent rules when it comes to mass media. In public consciousness and in literature, very often these attitudes are described as progressive or destructive. I believe that the general picture is much more complex, and I believe that Liu Yan was able to show how diverse this picture is. The candidate states that the aim of the study is to determine and describe content characteristics and mobilization potential of media construction of images of peasant protests in China. The aims and objectives have determined the structure of the dissertation. The structure is logical. She starts off with theoretical overview and moves forward to the analysis of data and practical recommendations. The study is well substantiated. Conclusions and recommendations are accurate due to the ample amount of statistical data and secondary sources of information. The candidate has resorted to field research. She employs a set of research methods and methodology, starting with discourse analysis to case study method. It allows me to state that the accuracy of the study is very high. The results of the study have been validated in Russia and abroad. The candidate has published 7 papers, including 6 papers in journals, in peer-reviewed journals approved by the Ministry of Science and Education of the Russian Federation. One of the journals is Scopus indexed. The novelty of the study is obvious. It's one of the first studies where images of peasant protests in China are studied so thoroughly in Russia, and the study is written in the Russian language. It shows ideological models of media construction of images of peasant protests in China. The candidate has studied selective coding of peasant protests in China, and it shows which consequences it creates for media communication in public sphere. She analyzes the contradictions which form the foundation of Chinese mass media when covering such conflicts. The theoretical background is ample and impressive. Many references are given to books in English and Chinese. The dissertation is written in very good Russian language, which is very impressive considering that Liu Yan is not a Russian language native speaker. I would like to especially highlight range of methods the candidate employs: British cultural research, political economy of communication, critical discourse analysis, and many others. I'm now running out of time, but I believe that theoretically and practically the study is valuable. The study is of applied value as well. It's a complete and comprehensive research. I think one aspect of your research requires more elaboration. The criteria which you use to differentiate between market-oriented and local or state-regulated mass media. You state that the privatization of news mass media in China is impossible, so they don't have private mass media. Hence, we can use this criteria to differentiate between public and private media. So this means that authorities anyway have tools to influence both public and market-oriented mass media, which undermines your classification. And if you think about it, public state-run mass media can also be driven by market interests to look at the target audience and so on. So it's not clear how state-owned mass media conducts its policy as regards poor members of the society. On page 55, you provide a diagram, a classification of Chinese mass media. You state that the journalistic community of China, professional journalists, are market-oriented. So market-oriented mass media is a gasp of air for professional journalism, because for them, public service is their professional priority. So for me, that's not quite clear. What does Chinese mass media target in the first place? Market or public social service? Anyway, I find your study impressive, and my critical remarks do not anyhow undermine the quality and value of your research. The dissertation by Liu Yan is in line with all the requirements set forth in the relevant order of St. Petersburg State University, and the candidate can be awarded the degree of the candidate of political sciences, specialization 10-0110 journalism. Item 11 of the relevant order has not been violated. Now the floor is given to Professor Kluev at St. Petersburg State University. Thank you. Distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, distinguished Chair, Liu Yan, I join the summary made by Professor Bykov. It's a systematic research. It is interesting with ample theoretical and practical background, and it's a pleasure for me that this scientific and research season we are closing off with such an impressive study. Now, colleagues, I'd like to turn to my report to save time. The study of Liu Yan focuses on media construction of images of peasant protests in China. Mass media is presented by local, state-run media sources as well as market-oriented media. The study is based on rich theoretical and empirical data. The study is done thoroughly with great attention to details, to mechanism used to cover Chinese peasant protests in mass media. Economic issues are often replaced with the efforts to fight for rights. Professional ethics is often violated, hence coverage is biased and unfair. All these factors make the study relevant and novel. Theoretically, the study regards mass media as a symbolic field of domination and struggle. It unveils mobilization potential of media frames. Practically, the study focuses on a range of issues: media protests and media activism, local mass media as a tool of demobilization, market-oriented media as means of mobilization, selective coding of protests used as a means of manipulation, the policy of mass media regulation as regards growing protests, professional characteristics of motivation when constructing the frame, struggle of the weak, and many others. The issues the candidate focuses on are more or less covered by different mass media. What makes the study novel is that it focuses on theoretical and practical material, which shows how mass media functions in China. She makes precise and valuable conclusions that show the quality of political process when it comes to the internal policy of the People's Republic of China, when it comes to social and economic environment and quality of rural population. The protest is described as a specific phenomenon. She shows which regulating and organizational features are used by political leaders and peasants, the activists that take part in process as stakeholders in the conflict. Mass media plays the key role in revealing the standpoints of protesters and officials. Rating is created as based on the attention of the audience to this or that material. Certain materials are used to actually incite protests. When mass media is not allowed to cover peasant protests, then the real course of affairs is hidden from sight, which can actually add fuel to confrontation. So it's very often the case when local authorities, which do not make attempts to overcome conflicts, are often described as corrupt by protesters. I do not have any critical remarks to this study, because the study is done at a high research level. It's a comprehensive study. There are only some minor misprints. All in all, the study is written at a high level, and the research has achieved the aims and objectives set in the introduction. My recommendation is that Liu Yan should publish a monograph or a teaching aid based on the materials of the study. In conclusion, I'd like to state that the study by Liu Yan is in line with all the requirements set forth in the relevant order of St. Petersburg State University on granting academic degrees. And Liu Yan can be awarded the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences, specialization 10-0110, journalism, item 11 of the relevant order has not been violated. Thank you, Professor Kluyev. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Shevchenko of RANEPA. Thank you, distinguished chair. I would like to extend my gratitude to the candidate as well as to the supervisor I was really pleased to read this study. It's a truly academic and scientific study. When I was reading the dissertation, I felt that Chinese mass media is really limited in voicing out their opinions. I understood that Liu Yan provided critical review of a broad range of materials, not only research literature. She also analyzed court rulings, conducted interviews, focused on the statements made by politicians, journalists, and many others. I think that she is brave enough to have done that. I caught myself thinking, is this study a tool of soft power? You can regard that as a joke, because it makes us believe that in China you can actually achieve much through this kind of research, but I was only joking. Now let's get back to our agenda. The introduction is impressive. There she gives an overview of political mass media environment in China, considering the position of China on the global arena. This overview is really valuable. The Communist Party is a ruling party, and it's a dominant power. And this model, their example, is the example might be followed by other countries with similar political regimes. The research findings, as the result of a thorough analysis, show that the study is a complete study with the focus on rich empirical data, with a very individual approach to analysis, and it's a major contribution to the theory of journalism. The first chapter gives an overview of the methodology Liu Yan applies in her study. All the methods are effectively used in all the following chapters of the dissertation. I will not speak about how Liu Yan managed to achieve this result. It's a rare case that candidates for the degree stick to the methodological tools they describe in the introduction to their dissertation. Very often, candidates fail to remember actually what they wrote on the very first pages of their dissertation. However, Liu Yan has been really consistent with the methodology throughout the dissertation. I'd like to highlight that land relations have always been catalysts for acute political and social conflicts, and mass media has always been acting as a tool to seize and retain power. This political regularity is studied thoroughly at the backdrop of the analysis of a handful of empirical data. Unfortunately, current Russian mass media does not provide effective coverage of land issues and territorial issues. Here I mean the Republic of Chechnya, Dagestan, and of course Ingushetia. The tool, which we call the forest hectare, has something to do with squandering land, splashing it around, because that is the territory which is of interest to both Russia and China. Liu Yan acts as an internal observer. She's not only fully aware of the political powers of China, she's also able to provide a deep understanding, insider's look on what's going on. The study gives a thorough analysis of all the media stakeholders. To do that, she gives a list of criteria that affect the relations towards peasant protests and their evaluation. The research findings are clearly written out in the dissertation, and I share the viewpoint of my colleagues who have provided high opinion of the study. Mass media have hegemonic position because they create the discourse of depoliticization or repoliticization of peasant protests. If we reverse this task, we could evaluate the position of mass media. Once they are supported by powers, then they will accept this or that position, which is typical not only for transit environments, but also established regimes. So mass media become an object of political or bureaucratic manipulation, which incite professional depoliticization or politicization of journalists. This effect is not only typical for Chinese mass media, but other countries in transition period. The existential component, the one which sympathizes with the human being, has always been true in the profile of professional journalism. However, this can affect a journalistic position, making them drive closer or further from the object of their work. To be fully satisfied with the study, I would say the candidate should have formulated the ultimate research finding about the mobilization potential of the concentrated media construction of images of peasant protests in China. The study is really valuable for Russian journalism as a field of study because it shows how mass media, Chinese mass media functions in current environment. It describes media policy in China in general as well. Research findings and results, as well as its conclusions, have been validated. The figures are convincing, and it's another advantage of the study. Drawing the conclusion, I would say that the dissertation written the topic Media Construction of Images of Peasant Protests in China is a qualification work. The aim and objectives of the study have theoretical and practical value for the theory of journalism and its practices, and the dissertation is in line with all the requirements set forth in the relevant regulations of St. Petersburg State University, and the candidate can be awarded the degree of the candidate of political sciences. Item 11 of the relevant order has not been violated. Liu Yan, you can take a seat if you find it more comfortable. Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Dmitry Strovsky, Ariel University, Israel. Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Once again, I'm the fourth to read out and to share my view on this dissertation, which means I have a bigger opportunity, unlike the first reports, on the analytical aspects of the study, the aspects I'm interested in as a scholar. I'm really fond of China. I've been there several times. I've talked to different kinds of people, all sorts of people. Originally, I wasn't much inspired by the topic of the dissertation, but that was only before I opened the pages of the dissertation, because I'm related to peasant protests to the same extent I'm related to belly. That's a joke, of course. But as I was getting deeper into the research, as it was unfolding, I was getting more and more engrossed into these research work. I wasn't that much moved by social issues. I was interested how social issues are embedded into the information space. And here I obviously cannot undermine all the advantages of this study. I will not repeat all these advantages. They have been outlined by my colleagues. She is a very thoughtful scholar, attentive to detail. And this is very remarkable of Chinese scholars. I often feel uneasy when I see how attentive Chinese scholars are to detail. The research topic is complex and challenging. Hence, there is a high level of expectation to this study. So now I'd like to focus on some questions and critical remarks. I accept that the study offers many terms, concepts and definitions that have been thoroughly developed, but there are many of them. And at a certain point, I lost my enthusiasm. For example, professional ideology. I did not quite understand what's meant by that. Political position of mass media, corporate interests. At some point, starting with page 30, there were a number of concepts: activism, dominating ideology, dominating frame, discourse, struggle. I was getting a bit bored because I was kind of jumping from one concept to the next one without any proper definitions given. I have a minimal qualification to understanding these kind of writings. However, that was difficult for me to grasp what was going on. You can say that I'm getting into the details and getting too particular. However, I do not share that. Some other issues I'd like to focus on. First, several times Liu Yan says that professional media space is getting more and more liberal. The word liberalism has been used several times, and at this point, colleagues, I would get very much surprised. China and liberalism. You must be joking. The gap between these two concepts is huge. And how could this become possible? Mao Zedong established the republic. How did this concept come alive? Some journalists decided that he has some liberal ideas in mind and he can share them. This is something I didn't quite understand. Socially discerned consciousness. This is what they say. But current environment in China is not at all liberal. So I really wonder how these examples could have appeared in your dissertation. Does it have something to do with peasant civic engagement? Are these only examples from 30 to 35 people, or is it something true for general public? So this is what I'm really interested in. This is where I had a question. Number 2, there is a lack of proper dividing line between so-called local or state media and market-oriented media. And I fail to understand whether market mass media is better than local or state-run mass media because they're more independent in their thinking process. Here we have a reference to the British scholar John Curran. I don't know whether he's still alive, but some 20 years ago I had a chance to talk with him. He is leftist in his views. Very often private media have a chance to criticize, and this is what we witness by the evidence of many countries. Private mass media can criticize institutions of power, and I could not understand that clearly what it's like in China. And the only reason for that is that you failed to provide a proper classification of Chinese mass media. One more thing that catches my eye is that there is a number of statements which have to be treated with more attention. They require a more thoughtful approach. What do I mean by that? Thoughtful when it comes to Chinese model, to Russian model. Well, Liu Yan very often opts out of criticism when providing overview of literature sources. So I would like to find out, what is your personal position, Liu Yan, on these questions? One more thing. If you continue to work and to elaborate this research topic. And I believe that you have all the foundations and all what it takes to conduct follow-up research. And I suppose that this impressive result is by and large due to your dissertation supervisor. Yet my question is that, do you support the journalists you described, or do you believe, based on traditional Chinese understanding, that this approach is not rational? This is the answer. This is the question I would like to see the answer to in your further scholarly efforts. But all in all, the study is independent, complete, and comprehensive. Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to Chair of the Dissertation Board, Professor Blachin of St. Petersburg University. A few words about the relevance of the study. The external condition to define its relevance is the proliferation of protests as a factor of political process in different regions of the world, which are marked by specific national and social components. This specifics is true to the features of media space, which create media projections of protests produced by protests of media environment, conceptual and evaluative media space. Discourse technologies used to regulate political process when it comes to protests do not go beyond the boundaries of classical types of journalism. What makes the study novel is the thorough analysis of the types of media construction of images of peasant protests in China. The candidate focuses on conceptual and functional characteristics of images of media protests depending on media types, orientation, ideological models, editorial and journalistic tools, effectiveness of publications when it comes to their influence on depoliticization and repoliticization. Peasant protests as the focus of journalistic attention are analyzed in view of depoliticization and repoliticization. The construction of images is viewed as a component of information and propaganda policy. The activity of journalists is interpreted against the backdrop of interaction with representatives of political leaders of different rank. The study has several advantages. Theoretically, she provides models of discourse media images in the environment of social conflicts. She provides evidence that conceptual constructs of mass media materials affect the world outlook of different groups of audiences, thus creating the groups of contradiction, cooperation, and sympathy. Thirdly, she specifies forms and types of media participation with evidence from mass media coverage of peasant protests in China against appropriation of land. The topic and the content of the study shows that the author is in favor of constructivism. The effectiveness of communication is only possible when it's based upon the values firmly established in public consciousness. The author manages to overcome conceptual limitations of the research. There are some minor recommendations that I have. For example, the way she words the object of the study and the subject of the study, because they lack this political direction of the research. There are some minor stylistic errors. Tables could have comprised a dedicated appendix to the dissertation. All in all, the study is aligned with the requirements to the specialization. I will omit this part. You can find it in my report. The study and the dissertation is very informative, and this is information really new to all of us. Liu Yan has a really individual approach to describing data and facts. I would also highlight the volume of empirical data, which otherwise would be difficult to find for Russian scholars, considering many sources are in Chinese. All in all, the dissertation by Liu Yan is in line with all the major requirements set forth in the relevant order of St. Petersburg State University on granting academic degrees, and the candidate can be awarded the degree of the candidate of political sciences, specialization journalism. Item 11 has not been violated. Now I'd like to give the floor to the candidate and provide answers to questions. You only have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Microphone.
I would like to thank all the members of the dissertation board for your critical remarks and questions. I will answer them in turns. First, I would like to answer the questions about the classification of mass media in China. Thank you for this remark. I believe that this is a disadvantage of my dissertation. Official or market-oriented, in other words, state or market-oriented mass media, these are not normative terms. These are descriptive terms. The first criteria to differentiate between mass media is how is they added to the party. Official press are the information bodies of central, regional, or local parties and government authorities. They are financed by authorities, and they gain their income from subscription and advertising. they are not tasked to gain profit on the market of public users. Market-oriented newspapers arose due to the mass media reform. These are mass media sources issued by different committees of the ruling party and editorial offices of official newspaper. However, they do not have this status of the party institution. I do not believe that there are contradictions between the factors I have outlined. As I state on page 136 of my dissertation, Russian version, if professional mass media through social service gain positive opinion of general public and increase the market share, then for market-oriented mass media, the economy of attention is the easiest way to gain profit. Market-oriented mass media opt for sensational materials on peasant protests and cover this issue in the line which shows that peasants are fighting for their rights, because this topic is more attractive for urban Chinese middle class. Thank you for the critical remark. I will take that into account in my further study. Now I'd like to answer the questions given by Professor Strovsky. I agree that in my future studies I will provide more synthesis and more comparative approach to a number of terms I used. But all these terms emerged in scholarly works back in the 90s. So I thought it was really important to define this concept and to provide a complete list of them. One more question was about the influence of international liberal concepts. Section 3 of Chapter 3 focuses on this important issue. As I said, market-oriented mass media cover protests in the context of liberal relations between the society and the state. This happened due to a number of factors. The pressure of public opinion, the liberal discourse on the issues of land ownership, and the antagonistic attitude between local authorities and journalists. So media discourse really shows liberalism. This is due to a journalist's own choice, which shows their professionalism. Liberalism and Western concept of journalism have been reproduced in China by a number of ways. You mentioned education that journalists receive abroad. Journalists might have their own personal preferences. However, my highlight was on the fact that this approach is now systematic and is dominating the reforms of openness and have been going on for already some time, and liberalistic reforms and attitudes are gaining momentum. Your third question on the function of media sphere. I focus on how peasant protests are covered in market-oriented media. I do not blame market for how these issues are covered. I try to show how market-oriented mass media actually cover protests and which stance they take. I agree with you that we cannot undermine the contribution of market-oriented mass media into the political communications of China due to certain drawbacks or disadvantages that they have. In my study, I write that, in my dissertation, I write that market-oriented mass media tries to oppose the political views promoted by controlling and regulatory authorities. Talking about the type of regime in China, it is now described as semi-authoritarian or the regime of transition. I must say that the experience of managing society in China and many scholarly books show that there are examples of mass media coverage of a certain conflict in China that is repeated in other mass media of other countries with similar regimes. I would like to thank the members of the board who did not provide critical remarks but gave recommendations for my future study. Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'd like to ask the non-board members and attendees, do you have any questions or remarks concerning the dissertation we're discussing? Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Galina Melnik, dissertation supervisor. You only have 3 minutes.
Микрофон включите.
Remember to switch on the microphone. Liu Yan is a research professional of a laboratory that focuses on the activism of rural population in China. She is single-minded, goal-oriented professional who is successful at combining professional and research activity. She received her degree in Guangzhou, China. She specialized in Russian and English. She then finished a master's program in a different university in China. She became master of translation in Chinese and Russian. She enrolled then on a postgraduate course in Vladivostok University. The field of study was mass media, information and library science. Throughout this time, she took part in different professional internships in Hokkaido in Japan. In summer last year, she participated in the summer school Global to Village. She had internships in a number of newspapers. She is a freelance journalist in the newspaper Russia Beyond Headlines. This project runs under the auspices of one of our graduates, Sewot Puli. Liu Yan applies her knowledge as a translator. She has translated a book by Strugatsky. It's a science fiction book from Russian into Chinese. So she is a professional translator. She has revealed herself as a hard-working and enthusiastic scholar. She has analyzed great amount of sources in Chinese, English, and Russian. She is successful at developing the traditions of Chinese, Russian, and international schools of thought. She described tendencies and trends typical for Chinese media of the given period. She is able to define criteria relevant for the analysis and research topic. She is open to new ideas and really effective at providing solutions to critical remarks given by experts. The material she has collected can become the foundation of teaching and learning aids, monographs and textbooks. I suppose professors who deal with Chinese studies really have to be thankful to such scientists as Liu Yan, because she is opening up really interesting aspects of Chinese life. And it's challenging to study China because of the limited openness. China is a really exciting and interesting country, rich in traditions. So now we have a chance, at least in translation, to read books by Chinese scholars. Because very often what's written about China by the scholars from US and other Western scholars is a bit lopsided. So what works as a good model to analyze European and Western media at large does not apply to Chinese mass media. This is because we do not fully understand the processes which go on in China. Maybe we are to blame in this respect. So what I'd like to say, what she has done has been done thoroughly. It's a complete and effective study. I'd like to extend gratitude to the members of the Dissertation Board who have provided deep analysis of the dissertation and have opened up new vistas for future collaboration with Chinese scholars. Thank you for your report. Now, let's turn to the discussion of the issue of granting or not granting the academic degree. Please switch off the broadcast, and I would like the non-board members, colleagues and attendees to leave the room. I will invite you back once the discussion is over. Just a few minutes.
Хорошо. Наше заседание продолжается.
Please switch on the broadcast. We continue the panel session of the Dissertation Board. Make sure that the broadcast works fine. I put to the vote the issue of conferring the academic degree. Let me remind you that in conformity with item 23 of the order on granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, that the decision of the Dissertation Board on conferring the academic degree is positive, provided it has received 50% of the votes from no fewer than 3 members of the Dissertation Board. Professor Bykov, what's your opinion? I believe that the candidate can be conferred the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences. I'm voting for. Professor Kluyev, what can you say? Thank you. I share my colleague's standpoint. I am voting for. Liu Yan can be awarded the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences. Professor Shevchenko, what about you? I support my colleagues. I'm voting for. Professor Strovsky, what's your opinion? I'm voting for. I'm Professor Blachin, Chair of the Dissertation Board. I'm voting for. Thus, dear colleagues and attendees, that 5 out of 5 members of the Dissertation Board have voted for conferring the academic degrees. We do not have any board members who have voted against or have abstained from voting. Liu Yan is awarded the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences. Specializations 10-0110 journalism. I'd like to extend my congratulations to the candidate, to Liu Yan and the dissertation supervisor. Liu Yan, you now have some minutes for the closing speech. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the members of the Dissertation Board for their useful and effective critical remarks that I will take into account in my future study. I'd like to thank my dissertation supervisor, who has been with me throughout this way, who was acting as a role model for me, how to be a great teacher. And when I was writing my dissertation, I was often repeating the word Dostoevsky to me, Dostoevsky words to me. The victim of life perhaps is the easiest of all the victims. But if you spare 5 or 6 years of your life on a challenging and difficult task, such as educating yourself, then it's not a victim at all. So I'm happy that I chose this path due to the contribution of my dissertation supervisor and my colleagues from the Higher School of Journalism and Mass Communications of St. Petersburg University. And I hope my contribution will be effective for the development of civil society in my home country. I would like to thank my parents who are now following the broadcast. It's only due to their support that I have become smarter, stronger, and happier. Once again, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the colleagues present here. Thank you for your active contribution. Thanks a lot. Dear colleagues, I'd like to thank all of you. On my behalf, I'd like to express my gratitude to the members of the Dissertation Board. And once again, I hope that we will meet with all of you in near future at other panel sessions of the Dissertation Board.